August 1944, Paris has become a battlefield. The streets of the City of Light are filled with chaos as communist insurgents, Gaullist resistance fighters and German forces clash. Amidst the ruins, the future of Paris hangs in the balance. But one man stands in the way of Paris's destruction. General Dietrich von Choltitz, appointed by Hitler himself, faces an impossible choice: follow orders and level one of the world's greatest cities, or defy the Führer's final command. This is the untold story of the last fight for Paris, how one general's defiance against Hitler's orders would change World War II. By late summer 1944, the Third Reich was facing encirclement. 2 years prior, Adolf Hitler had swiftly conquered 10 European nations, alongside parts of North Africa and the Soviet Union. However, the tides had turned. The global alliance opposing him reclaimed most of these territories, liberating country after country. As summer drew to a close, Hitler experienced a major setback. Warsaw, the first city he had seized, fell. After almost 5 years under German rule, Poland's capital now faced a new form of oppression under Soviet control, as Stalin's forces took over. The Soviet dictator, Joseph Stalin, shrewdly let the Germans handle the dirty work in Warsaw. Expecting the Soviet advance, local resistance forces initiated a massive revolt. But Stalin, seeing the underground fighters as a future obstacle, halted his troops just outside the city, withholding support. During this pause, the Nazis crushed the uprising, wiping out the Polish resistance. By the time the Soviet army resumed its march, the resistance was no longer a threat to their occupation. Hitler, inspired by Stalin's cold-blooded tactics, chose to follow a similar strategy in the West. As Allied forces closed in on Paris, Hitler, determined not to let them enjoy a clean victory, issued orders to leave the city in ruins. He wanted the Allies to find nothing but destruction upon their arrival. Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower found himself deeply concerned about Paris as well. Even though he was one of the most influential figures globally at the time, he felt powerless and frustrated when it came to deciding how to handle the French capital. There was immense pressure from around the world to liberate Paris, known as a centre of art and culture. However, Eisenhower faced significant logistical and tactical challenges, forcing him to delay moving his troops forward. Eisenhower had just gone over a 24-page report that laid out the harsh reality of what liberating Paris would cost. It warned that such an effort would drain Allied resources and push back the timeline for taking over the rest of German-occupied Europe. The biggest hurdle was fuel. Normandy's beaches were still the primary hub for unloading everything the army needed: gasoline, weapons, food, spare parts, and even reinforcements and mail. There were tactical issues too. Eisenhower's command, SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, aimed to cross the Rhine before autumn rains bogged down operations. So, after weighing the situation, the command decided Paris could wait. Instead, they devised a different plan. We have partnered with Manta Sleep to bring you today's video, the makers of the world's most effective sleep masks and functional sleep accessories. You might be asking yourself, what does Manta Sleep have to do with World War II history? Well, let me explain. Even during the chaos of war, quality sleep was crucial for both soldiers and commanders. And in our daily lives, good sleep is just as important. It's like your secret weapon. Personally, balancing multiple businesses while running this history-focused YouTube channel can be pretty demanding. Late nights are common for me, and as someone who's deeply passionate about history, I understand how essential it is to balance a busy life with proper rest. Manta Sleep's adjustable masks are designed to fit perfectly, providing 100% blackout and using soft, breathable materials that feel amazing. Their unique eye cups take the pressure off your eyes, making it easy to unwind. They offer a variety of sleep masks, from the cool mask to the steam mask and even the pro mask weighted mask. For those who enjoy unwinding with some audio, they also have a mask equipped with Bluetooth speakers, which I love, great for even listening to my videos or anything to help you sleep. I can't thank Manta Sleep enough for sponsoring today's video. Be sure to check them out using the link in the description, and don't forget to use the code HistoryAtWar to save 10% on your purchase. Investing in quality sleep is truly life-changing. British Field Marshal Sir Bernard Law Montgomery's 21st Army Group would push east between the Seine and Oise rivers, take the port of Le Havre, a vital supply point, and destroy the V1 and V2 rocket sites in Pas-de-Calais. At the same time, the US 12th Army Group would move eastward, cross the Seine at Melun, head north for 100 miles, then swing west at Reims to join forces with the British moving south from Amiens. Tactically, this plan seemed sound. Encircling Paris would neutralise its German defenders, avoiding a brutal urban battle and thwarting Hitler's plan to destroy the city. The terrain favoured the Allies' tanks and vehicles, and precious gasoline could be saved for the looming assault on Germany's Siegfried Line. The operation was tentatively scheduled for mid-September to early October. Eisenhower found the plan to bypass a direct assault on Paris acceptable, but General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, certainly did not. From the beginning of the war, de Gaulle had a rocky relationship with both the Americans and the British. Tensions often flared between him, President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He was particularly irked by the US recognition of the Vichy government that collaborated with the Germans, and by being left out of the loop on the American landings in North Africa in 1942. De Gaulle had more than just military concerns on his mind. There was the complex political landscape of Europe to deal with. He was fiercely determined to prevent France from becoming a communist stronghold after the war. To that end, he sent spies to infiltrate the predominantly left-wing resistance movement. When these operatives reported that the communist underground was planning a massive uprising to liberate Paris and potentially install a communist government before the Allies even got there, de Gaulle knew time was running out. The liberation of Paris wasn't just about freeing the city, it was about securing the political future of France and, to a large extent, Western Europe. According to his intelligence, the communists had about 25,000 armed fighters in Paris, outnumbering the German occupiers. It was entirely possible they could drive out the Nazis on their own, seize control and plunge the country into a devastating civil war with de Gaulle's forces. From his headquarters in Algiers, de Gaulle made a calculated move. He ordered a halt to all airdrops of supplies into Paris and the surrounding areas, aiming to slow down any independent actions by the resistance. He also sent his most trusted lieutenants into the city to convince as many resistance groups as possible, regardless of their political leanings, to wait. His goal was to delay any uprisings until he could push the Allies to move toward Paris again. Meanwhile, Hitler was making his own plans for the city. Hitler's emotional scars from World War I were deeply intertwined with his fixation on Paris. The devastation of the First World War, especially Germany's inability to capture the city, left an indelible mark on him. After losing 2 million soldiers in the trenches, Hitler saw Paris as a symbol of redemption and revenge. Capturing the city during World War II brought him unmatched personal satisfaction. However, this satisfaction turned into obsession when the threat of losing Paris again became real. Hitler's pride would not allow him to relinquish the city, and he vowed that if Paris was on the verge of being liberated, it would be destroyed rather than falling into enemy hands. As the war began to turn against Germany, Hitler appointed Major General Dietrich von Choltitz as the military governor of Paris in August 1944, with specific orders to prevent the city from being taken by any means necessary, including its destruction. Choltitz, an officer from a long-standing military family, had earned Hitler's trust through his unflinching obedience, loyalty and ruthless efficiency, particularly after the failed assassination attempt on the Führer in July 1944. With a reputation for relentless aggression, he had a proven track record on both the Eastern and Western fronts. His service in Russia, where the fighting had been brutal, especially highlighted his capability to follow orders without question. This trust would be essential in ensuring Hitler's will to destroy Paris was carried out. At least, so Hitler believed. Choltitz's ruthlessness had been demonstrated earlier in the war, notably during the destruction of Rotterdam in 1940, when his forces bombed the city before the Dutch had a chance to surrender, leaving it in ruins. His tenacity was further displayed during the prolonged siege of Sevastopol in 1942. Despite losing the majority of his regiment, he continued to push forward, utilizing Russian prisoners of war to keep his artillery supplied, a testament to both his determination and his willingness to resort to extreme measures to achieve victory. With Sevastopol in ruins and most of his men dead, Choltitz emerged as one of Hitler's most trusted commanders, willing to carry out even the most destructive of orders. However, by the time Choltitz arrived in Paris, the situation was different. The relentless Soviet advance on the Eastern Front had shaken his once unwavering belief in the Nazi cause. The promise Hitler had made during a tour of the Russian front in 1943, that the German army could wear down the Soviet forces, seemed increasingly hollow. The Soviet juggernaut was proving unstoppable, and the futility of Hitler's orders became apparent. Choltitz, who had previously enforced the scorched earth policy without hesitation, began to see the larger picture. The destruction of Paris, a city of immense cultural and historical significance, seemed unnecessary and wasteful, especially as the war was clearly lost. Choltitz's change of heart represented a departure from his earlier blind obedience. He began questioning whether mass destruction still served any purpose other than fulfilling the Führer's delusional desire for vengeance. Despite his fear of retribution from Hitler and the Nazi leadership, Choltitz ultimately made the decision to defy the order to destroy Paris. His willingness to disobey Hitler in this crucial moment not only spared Paris from ruin, but also marked a turning point in the war, as it signalled a growing recognition among some German commanders of the destruction of Europe. By choosing to protect the city, Choltitz ensured that Paris would survive the war, intact and ready for whatever the future may hold. 1 year later, in the summer of 1944, Choltitz was summoned to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. What he encountered there was a profoundly unsettling scene. The once commanding Führer had deteriorated into a frail and unstable figure, both physically and mentally. Hitler's sharp decline was evident not only in his appearance but also in his behaviour. Choltitz listened uneasily as Hitler concluded his diatribe by issuing a new directive. He was to be sent to Paris to crush all civilian acts of disobedience or terrorism with unrelenting force. The words carried an ominous tone, and as Choltitz left the secluded headquarters, he felt a creeping sense of dread. It appeared to be yet another scorched earth assignment, the kind of ruthless destruction Hitler had grown infamous for. However, this time, the target was not some remote town in the endless Russian plains. It was Paris, the heart of European culture, art and beauty. For the first time in his military career, Choltitz began to seriously consider the possibility of disobeying a direct order from Hitler. Destroying Paris seemed not only unnecessary but also a crime against civilization itself. The following morning, as Choltitz's train stopped in Baden-Baden, he was afforded a brief but poignant reunion with his family. His wife, Huberta, greeted him with a quiet joy, their 3 children, 14-year-old Maria Angelica, 8-year-old Anna Barbara, and baby Timo, surrounding them. The night before, during a brief stop in Berlin, Choltitz had received news of his promotion to general, along with the 2 silver bars that symbolized his new rank. It was meant to be a moment of pride, but instead it felt hollow, weighed down by the knowledge of the grim task ahead. As Huberta sat by his side, carefully sewing the new insignia onto his uniform, she sensed the invisible burden that now hung over her husband. She didn't ask, and Choltitz didn't speak of it. There was no need for words. The tension in the air was thick, and the children, though young, felt it too. It was as if Choltitz carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, not just his own future, but that of Paris and perhaps his family, depending on the choices he made. Back in East Prussia, Hitler was consumed by his own anger and frustration. His once unshakable grip on Europe was slipping, and the Allied bombings of German cities only fueled his bitterness. In his view, if German cities were being reduced to rubble, why should Paris, the crown jewel of Europe, be spared? Why should we care if Paris is destroyed? Hitler remarked coldly. The Allies are bombing cities across Germany into rubble right now. His words reflected a growing disdain for the idea of sparing anything, as the war was lost in all but name. Paris was now nothing more than a pawn in his game of vengeance, and the man he had chosen to enforce that fate was on his way, carrying both his new insignia and the crushing weight of his moral dilemma. For Choltitz, the hours spent with his family were precious but fleeting. As the train pulled away from Baden-Baden, leaving Huberta and the children behind, he was left alone with his thoughts. The tension that had been unspoken between him and his wife now grew louder in his mind. The thought of Paris in ruins, a city known for its art, culture and beauty, gnawed at him. Could he follow through with Hitler's orders to raze it to the ground if it came to that, or would this be the moment he finally chose to disobey? As his train hurtled toward Paris, the future of the city, and perhaps Choltitz's own legacy, hung in the balance. When Choltitz arrived in Paris, he was greeted with the grim reality that the city had been wired for destruction. Lieutenant General Gunther Blumentritt informed him that the German garrison had explicit orders to demolish Paris if they were forced to retreat. The 813th Engineer Company had already begun placing explosives at key strategic locations. Among the top priorities were the city's water and electrical systems, but the engineers had started with the iconic bridges spanning the Seine. These historic structures, centuries old, were not just architectural marvels, but critical for any advancing army. Destroying them would effectively halt any Allied advance across the wide, winding river. But the destruction didn't stop there. Explosives had been rigged at some of Paris's most treasured landmarks. The 400-year-old Palais de Luxembourg, home to priceless art and literature, was among the many targets. Other key sites, such as the Chamber of Deputies, the French Foreign Office, telephone exchanges, train stations, and airplane factories, were also wired with charges. The city was a ticking time bomb, and Choltitz knew that if the Allies closed in, a single order could turn Paris into a smouldering ruin. On August 17, 1944, a cable arrived from Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, bluntly ordering Choltitz to carry out the destruction plan. "I give the order for the neutralization and destruction envisaged for Paris." Choltitz, who had built his military career on strict obedience, now faced an unimaginable moral conflict. His orders were clear, but the weight of destroying one of the world's greatest cities, a place that had stood for centuries as a symbol of culture and civilization, bore heavily on him. His Prussian upbringing had taught him to obey without question, yet for the first time his conscience tugged in the opposite direction. Could he really be the man responsible for such devastation? While Choltitz wrestled with his conscience, the military situation around Paris was deteriorating rapidly. Just west of the city, Lieutenant Colonel Hubertus von Auloch was hastily organising a defence perimeter in a 60-mile arc designed to slow the advancing Allied forces. Both Auloch and Choltitz knew that their 10,000 troops were hopelessly outnumbered and under-equipped to hold the line. Reinforcements had been promised from Berlin, but they seemed unlikely to arrive in time to make a difference. Ever resourceful, Choltitz removed all 88mm anti-aircraft guns from the city and positioned them along the defence line, where they could be used as anti-tank weapons against the Allies. It was a desperate measure in increasingly desperate times. Within Paris, preparations for the city's destruction continued. Hundreds of U-boat torpedoes were being stacked in a tunnel beneath central Paris. If detonated, they would obliterate the heart of the city, leaving nothing but a smoking crater. As the explosives were set, alarm spread through the city. Mayor Pierre-Charles Taittinger, who had been a collaborator with the Nazis but was now horrified by the scale of the destruction being prepared, visited Choltitz to demand an explanation. When Taittinger confronted Choltitz, the general's weariness and stress were evident. "As an officer, Monsieur Taittinger, you understand that there are measures I must take. My duty is to slow the Allies as much as possible," Choltitz explained. But Taittinger, incredulous, could hardly believe that anyone would consider destroying a city as iconic as Paris. He had worked with the Germans, but he could not fathom the total destruction of such a treasured place. Sensing Choltitz's discomfort, Taittinger decided to take a bold step. As the general was hit by a violent coughing fit, Taittinger used the moment to guide him toward a nearby window. From there, they could see the beauty of Paris stretched out before them. The manicured gardens of the Tuileries, the bustling Rue de Rivoli, the imposing Notre Dame, the Seine glistening in the distance, and the proud silhouette of the Eiffel Tower. Taittinger seized the moment, speaking with urgency. "Often a general's duty is to destroy," he said, "rarely to preserve. Imagine that one day you could stand on this balcony again as a tourist and see these monuments to our joys and sufferings. Wouldn't it be better to say, 'One day I could have destroyed this, but instead I preserved it as a gift to humanity'? General, is that not worth more than all the glory of a conqueror?" For a moment Choltitz was silent, looking out over the city. He glanced to the left at the Louvre, then to the right at the Place de la Concorde, landmarks that had stood for centuries and had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. The weight of Taittinger's words hung in the air. Choltitz turned back to the mayor, his expression unreadable. "You've argued well for Paris, Monsieur Taittinger," he finally said. "You've done your duty. As a German general, I must do mine." With those words, Choltitz was left to make a choice that would define not only his legacy, but the fate of Paris itself. Would he follow Hitler's orders and reduce the city to rubble, or would he defy the regime and preserve one of humanity's greatest treasures? Time was running out, and events within the city were quickly spiralling out of control. The world would soon learn whether Paris would endure or be lost to history forever.
We were ordered to clear the streets of barricades near the Latin Quarter. It was chaos, bullets flying everywhere. We didn't know who was shooting at us. One moment it was silent, the next, gunfire erupted from every direction. I saw one of our tanks hit by a Molotov cocktail. The flames spread quickly, and the crew burned inside. I will never forget their screams. We chased them into a building, but when we entered, it was empty. They had disappeared like shadows. I was terrified. They were like ghosts, impossible to catch. Every day more of our men died. we knew we couldn't hold out much longer. Paris was supposed to be our stronghold, but now it feels like a tomb. The Allies are advancing, and we are losing ground every day. The resistance is growing bolder, and we don't have the manpower or resources to fight them properly. I no longer believe in our cause, but what can we do? Orders are orders. We wait for the final battle, knowing it will not end well for us. One day, I passed a group of French civilians tearing down our posters and burning the flags in the street. A young woman glared at me with such hatred that I couldn't look her in the eye. How did it come to this? We were once proud soldiers, but now we are nothing more than occupiers, unwanted and despised.
On August 19, 1944, General de Gaulle made his decisive move, unleashing the underground French forces to rise against the Germans before the communist fighters, or Reds, could fully mobilise. Across the city, de Gaulle's Gaullist troops launched swift and coordinated assaults on German strongholds. The communist fighters, who had long been preparing for such an opportunity, quickly joined the fray, and soon Paris was engulfed in chaotic fighting. Resistance fighters, armed with a mismatched arsenal of Molotov cocktails, aging shotguns, World War I-era level rifles, and slow-firing Hotchkiss machine guns, took to the streets in a fierce attempt to free their city. The German forces, determined to maintain control, retaliated harshly, and destruction across Paris began to mount.
A US journalist described the scene on the radio. From where I am speaking to you, I can hear the explosions of shells and the spatter of machine guns. Bosch machine guns of the regular army, and the machine guns of the FFI. The Germans set fire to the Navy Ministry and the Hotel Crillon, and the sky is ablaze in the direction of Neuilly and Vincennes. These are the last jerks of the beast receiving the mortal blow.
The police prefecture quickly became the epicenter of the uprising. On August 20th, just after dawn, Choltitz ordered tanks and dive bombers to strike at the heart of the resistance. His forces targeted the rebels who had entrenched themselves in the prefecture, hoping to quash the insurrection before it could spread further. Despite his orders to destroy Paris if necessary, Choltitz was conflicted. A direct and brutal assault on central Paris would not only leave a lasting stain on his reputation, but might also fulfill Hitler's command to level the city. In an effort to contain the violence and limit the destruction, Swedish consul Raoul Nordling stepped in. He arranged a meeting with Choltitz, proposing a ceasefire with the resistance fighters holding the prefecture. Choltitz, increasingly aware of the moral consequences of ordering an all-out assault in one of the world's most famous cities, found the proposal appealing. A ceasefire would give him time to reconsider his orders and avoid further tarnishing his legacy. The truce came at a pivotal moment, as General de Gaulle was heading to a high-stakes meeting with General Eisenhower. Eisenhower, commander of the Allied forces, was frustrated by the growing chaos in Paris. From his perspective, de Gaulle's sudden offensive appeared to be a politically motivated move to position himself as the future leader of France. With the American, British and Free French forces still approaching from the west, Eisenhower was torn. The Allies needed to hurry if they were to prevent the partisans from being crushed by the Germans and stop Paris from suffering the same fiery fate as Warsaw, where an earlier uprising had led to mass slaughter and destruction. However, rushing to Paris would mean delaying the broader Allied campaign across Western Europe, potentially prolonging the war. Even when Eisenhower learned that de Gaulle hadn't directly instigated the revolt, he remained frustrated, believing that de Gaulle was forcing the Allies to adjust their strategy for his own political gain. Eisenhower's strategic concerns were compounded by a grim report. Hitler was diverting troops from Denmark to reinforce Paris. The Nazi regime had no intention of letting the city fall easily, yet de Gaulle was adamant. He even threatened to withdraw the 2nd Free French Armoured Division from the main Allied forces and send it to Paris on its own. For de Gaulle, allowing the communists to seize control of the city was unthinkable. Without his leadership, France was at risk of falling to communism after the war, and no other figure had the stature or the influence to stand against the communist forces. The fate of France, as well as the liberation of Paris, was hanging in the balance. Inside the city, the communist underground, led by Henri Tanguy, known as Colonel Roll, was determined to break the ceasefire. Tanguy viewed the truce as a betrayal, denouncing it as a right-wing plot to wipe out the working class of Paris. He was intent on continuing the fight, seeing the ceasefire as a tactic by de Gaulle to claim credit for liberating Paris. Tanguy wanted the communist forces, not the Gaullists, to be seen as the liberators. As the ceasefire held tenuously, Tanguy gave the chilling order to his forces to continue attacking the German troops, no matter the cost. His cold proclamation echoed through the ranks. Paris, he declared, is worth 200,000 dead. The city was now teetering on the edge, with the communists pushing to break the ceasefire and the Germans digging in to defend their hold on Paris. Choltitz found himself trapped between conflicting orders and mounting pressure. Would he carry out Hitler's command to destroy the city, or would he defy the dictator and allow Paris to be liberated intact? The fate of the City of Light hung in the balance, as both the future of France and the outcome of the war itself seemed to converge on these decisive days in August 1944. By the evening of August 20th, the fragile ceasefire in Paris had completely disintegrated and full-scale combat erupted across the city. Communist insurgents and German forces clashed fiercely, with resistance fighters determined to continue their struggle. Henry Tanguy's communist forces had already lost 106 men by midnight, and the toll on both sides was rising. As the violence escalated, Choltitz stood at a critical juncture. He was prepared to launch a devastating counterattack against the insurgents and begin executing Hitler's orders to demolish Paris. The destruction of the city seemed imminent, but then an unexpected twist changed the course of events. An SS patrol, operating under routine checks, arrested 3 resistance officers in a car loaded with weapons and classified documents. The men, who called themselves ministers of de Gaulle, were Gaullist agents, and their arrest marked a pivotal moment. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, the SS commander immediately reported the arrest to German headquarters. One of the men, Alexandre Paradis, was no ordinary resistance fighter. He was General de Gaulle's top representative in occupied France, a key figure in coordinating the Gaullist resistance efforts. Paradis was promptly brought before Choltitz. In the tense meeting, Paradis carefully laid out the catastrophic consequences that would follow if the truce completely collapsed. He explained that a full-scale uprising would only lead to mass civilian casualties and the destruction of Paris, a city both sides wanted to preserve, albeit for different reasons. To everyone's surprise, Choltitz made a critical decision. He ordered the release of the 3 Gaullist officers, including Paradis, in hopes that they could restore some semblance of order to the increasingly volatile situation. The release of Paradis and the others was a strategic move. The Gaullists had been preparing for such a moment with a contingency plan, Operation Prise du Pouvoir, Operation Seizure of Power. De Gaulle's government in exile had secretly positioned a network of counterparts in Paris, ready to assume control when the time came. Paradis quickly contacted these figures, pulling together an impromptu cabinet that would be the foundation of the new government. He set up his temporary headquarters at the Hôtel de Matignon, preparing to declare it the seat of government. His goal was clear: to establish the legitimacy of de Gaulle's government in Paris before the communists could seize control. Meanwhile, tensions between the Gaullists and the communists reached a boiling point. In an apartment overlooking Parc Montsouris, representatives of both sides met to discuss the rapidly unfolding events. The atmosphere was charged, with the communists making their position unmistakably clear. They had no intention of stopping the fight against the Nazis, and they warned the Gaullists of the consequences if de Gaulle failed to join the uprising. The communists, who were deeply invested in the ongoing battle, threatened to plaster posters throughout the city, accusing de Gaulle of stabbing the people of Paris in the back if he didn't take decisive action. The communists believed that the fighting had already reached a point of no return. For them, the truce was not just fragile, it was dead. They were determined to see the fight through to the end, regardless of the cost. The meeting between the two factions did little to bridge the divide. The communists were fully committed to continuing their battle against the Nazis, and they made it clear that they were not interested in any compromise that would stop the uprising. With the ceasefire shattered, the situation in Paris grew increasingly dire. Choltitz, now caught between the destruction orders from Hitler and his own growing reluctance to see Paris in ruins, had made a gesture by releasing the Gaullist officers. But whether this would be enough to restore any semblance of order remained uncertain. The communists, resolute in their defiance, would not back down, and the battle for control of Paris and its future was far from over. While the resistance leaders in Paris debated their next steps, General Jacques-Philippe Leclerc, commander of the 2nd Free French Armoured Division, was 122 miles away, poised to move his 16,000-strong force toward the capital. Leclerc had been resourceful in keeping his division well supplied. He cleverly avoided reporting the true extent of his unit's losses, ensuring a steady flow of American fuel and ammunition for tanks and vehicles that had already been destroyed in previous engagements. With this hidden surplus, he kept his division in fighting shape, ready for a push toward Paris. When he learned of the increasingly dire situation in the city, Leclerc took matters into his own hands. Over 3 nights he dispatched small units to scavenge additional fuel and ammunition from US depots, keeping his force battle ready despite their official supply lines running dry. Leclerc knew that time was running out, so he attempted to contact Eisenhower's headquarters, seeking permission to advance on Paris. His request, however, languished in the chain of command, receiving no official response. Recognizing the urgency in the early hours of August 21st, Leclerc made the bold decision to act on his own. He prepared to move his division toward the capital without authorization. Unknown to Leclerc, the Germans were inadvertently aiding his plan. Reinforcements sent from Denmark had been stationed south of Paris, where the Wehrmacht believed the main Allied offensive would originate. Choltitz, misreading this redeployment, assumed Paris was becoming less of a priority for the Allies, and leaned more toward following Hitler's orders to destroy the city before they arrived. Meanwhile, in a dramatic turn of events, a young Gaullist operative named Roger Gallois took matters into his own hands. Gallois, driven by the urgent need to save Paris, ventured directly into the American lines. He arrived at Lieutenant General George Patton's headquarters in the middle of the night, waking him up with an impassioned plea to send the Third Army to Paris. However, Patton, known for his aggressive tactics, was bound by Eisenhower's orders and could not authorize the move. Undeterred, Gallois sped off again, this time heading west to the 12th Army Group headquarters. By the early hours of August 22nd, Gallois found Brigadier General Edwin Sibert, the group's intelligence officer, and made his emotional appeal. With tears streaming down his face, Gallois pleaded with Sibert to convince the Americans to act before it was too late. Paris, he warned, could be lost if immediate action wasn't taken. Sibert, moved by Gallois' desperation, promised to press the issue with Eisenhower. As it turned out, Eisenhower had already begun reconsidering his stance. Now settled in his new headquarters at Grand Champ, Eisenhower had received another urgent message from de Gaulle, stressing the gravity of the situation. The combination of Gallois' appeal and de Gaulle's message had the desired effect. Eisenhower finally gave the order to move. The massive Anglo-American liberation force would advance toward Paris, closely following Leclerc's division. The race to liberate the City of Light had officially begun. Back in Paris, both Gaullist and communist resistance fighters found themselves dangerously low on ammunition, while the Germans, still unchallenged by Allied ground forces, intensified their efforts to crush the rebellion. The fighting had turned the inner city into a war zone, reminiscent of the destruction in Warsaw. French civilian and resistance casualties climbed, with over 500 dead by August 23rd. Meanwhile, Nazi engineers continued laying explosives throughout the city, with plans to demolish its most iconic structures. Mines were set in the basement of Les Invalides, threatening the destruction of not only the French Army Museum and military art galleries, but also centuries-old barracks and Napoleon's tomb. That morning, SS sappers had begun surveying the best places to rig explosives under the supports of the Eiffel Tower, determined to reduce the symbol of France to rubble. The urban combat began to subside as resistance fighters, outgunned and out of ammunition, were forced to retreat and hide. Yet, they had succeeded in their main task, keeping the Germans occupied long enough for the Allies to close in. The German forces in Paris, realizing they were out of time, shifted their focus to reinforcing the defensive perimeter west of the city. But their delay in dealing with the rebels proved costly. The 2nd Free French Armoured Division and the US 4th Infantry Division were now closing in fast. The Germans repositioned their powerful 88mm flak guns, and as the French neared, these deadly weapons opened fire. Despite the desperate German efforts, their plans to destroy Paris faltered. The Luftwaffe had been preparing a massive bombing raid on the night of August 24th to 25th, aiming to obliterate large parts of the city. However, General Choltitz intervened once again, storming into the Luftwaffe's command office and furiously cancelling the raid. He argued that the bombing would kill as many Germans as Parisians, making the destruction senseless. The air raid was called off, a rare reprieve for the embattled city. As the Allies drew nearer, the fighting in the countryside became fierce. Ernest Hemingway, who had been scouting the roads into Paris for mines, reported them clear, but what he failed to spot were the camouflaged artillery positions concealed in nearby fields. Haystacks in the wheat fields masked the 88mm flak guns of the 11th Flak Regiment waiting in ambush. When the French Shermans rolled through, these deadly guns opened fire. Rather than retreating, the French tankers, determined to be the first to liberate Paris, charged headlong into the assault. Firing on the move, they took out or bypassed the 88s, suffering heavy losses in the process but saving precious time. As the sound of artillery echoed through Paris, it emboldened the resistance fighters. Sporadic attacks on the remaining German forces resumed, forcing the Germans to fight on two fronts. Meanwhile, German officials scrambled to burn incriminating documents in a last-ditch effort to hide important information. The resistance fighters, now galvanized by the impending arrival of the Allies, sabotaged German demolition efforts. They began disarming the explosives already in place, preventing the destruction of key landmarks. A convoy of 6 German trucks, filled with explosives and en route to destroy the Chamber of Deputies, was ambushed and destroyed by a united front of Gaullist and Communist fighters. At the same time, American General Omar Bradley, overseeing the final push toward Paris, had initially believed the approaches to the city were lightly defended, but as the 2nd Armoured Division pressed forward, they encountered unexpectedly fierce German resistance. Leclerc's division bore the brunt of the German counterattacks. When reports of heavy French casualties reached Bradley, he immediately ordered the US 4th Infantry Division to accelerate their advance. By the evening of August 24th, the Americans caught up with Leclerc's forces on the outskirts of Paris. Captain Raymond Dron, Leclerc's aide, changed into civilian clothes and slipped into the city under cover of darkness. He made contact with the resistance, delivering the long-awaited message. Paris would be liberated that night or the next day. However, despite the impending Allied arrival, Choltitz was not ready to surrender. He had no desire to destroy Paris, but as a soldier, he was determined to defend his position to the end. That evening, Choltitz addressed his staff with a grim resolve. "I will personally shoot in my own office the next man who comes to me suggesting we abandon Paris without a fight," he declared. His words underscored his lingering sense of duty as a military officer, even as the city he was charged to defend was on the brink of liberation. At 9:30 p.m. on August 24th, Leclerc's tanks rumbled into the heart of Paris, marking the beginning of the city's liberation. The atmosphere was electric. Amid deafening cheers and the stirring strains of La Marseillaise, jubilant Parisians swarmed the grimy, battle-worn tank crews, pulling them from their vehicles in a wild frenzy of celebration. The soldiers, though exhausted, were greeted as heroes by the ecstatic crowds. The noise of the celebration drowned out the occasional gunfire, but by this point the fighting was largely over. What remained was little more than isolated resistance and clean-up operations. Most of the 20,000 German troops left in the city, softened by 4 years of comfortable occupation duty, had no desire to fight a well-trained professional army. Eager to surrender, they laid down their arms. By noon the next day, August 25th, the French tricolour was flying proudly once again atop the Eiffel Tower. Meanwhile, far away in the gloomy forests of East Prussia, Hitler was in a state of agitation. Frantically, he kept asking his chief of staff, "Is Paris burning?" The Führer's obsession with razing the city to the ground had consumed him, but his orders had been defied. Paris was not burning. Choltitz, caught between his military duty and his humanity, had refused to destroy the city. Resigned to his fate, Choltitz awaited the inevitable. Just after 1 p.m. on August 25th, a young officer from Leclerc's division entered his office. "I am Lieutenant Henri Karcher of General de Gaulle's army," the French officer announced. Choltitz, rising from his desk, introduced himself. "General von Choltitz, commander of Greater Paris." Karcher then declared, "You are my prisoner." Choltitz offered no resistance. Though Paris had been saved, his war was over. Karcher had only a small contingent of men with him, but their task was to escort Choltitz through the chaotic streets of Paris, where the crowds were eager for revenge. The German general was driven through the city in a staff car, making it to his destination, with only a few scratches and bruises from the angry masses. Choltitz was taken to the Hôtel de Ville, where Leclerc had established his temporary headquarters. There, the German general formally signed the surrender papers, officially marking the end of the Nazi occupation of Paris. After signing, Choltitz waited in silence for 3 hours, knowing that the weight of history was pressing down on the moment. Finally, at 4:30 p.m, a convoy of 3 cars arrived at the Hôtel de Ville. General de Gaulle stepped out, tall and imposing, ready to reclaim the city in the name of Free France. However, as de Gaulle reviewed the capitulation document, his expression darkened. His face flushed with anger when he noticed that Communist leader Henri Tanguy had arrived earlier and signed the surrender papers before him, ensuring his name appeared ahead of de Gaulle's. The symbolic gesture infuriated de Gaulle, who was determined to establish himself as the leader of post-war France and prevent the communists from claiming any undue credit for the liberation of Paris. Despite the tension, Paris had been taken by the Americans, and the moment belonged to the French people. Paris had survived the war intact and the long years of occupation. In the end, it was not Henri Tanguy or the communists who claimed the spotlight. It was Charles de Gaulle who took control of France's government and emerged as the undisputed leader. De Gaulle, with his imposing stature and indomitable presence, became the central figure in the victory celebrations. On August 26, 1944, during the triumphant victory parade, de Gaulle marched through the streets of Paris, towering over the crowd. As he strode confidently down the Champs-Élysées, a would-be assassin took aim from one of the towers of Notre Dame Cathedral. In an act that would forever endear him to the French people, de Gaulle coolly ignored the gunfire, walking calmly while others around him ducked for cover. The gunman was not a German, but a leftist partisan loyal to Tanguy, further inflaming tensions between the Gaullists and the communists. The brazen attempt on de Gaulle's life enraged many French citizens, pushing them firmly against the idea of a communist takeover. This moment solidified de Gaulle's image as the man who had restored French dignity, a leader who remained unshaken even under fire. De Gaulle's fearless march was followed by his proclamation of the French Republic to an adoring crowd, ensuring that the future of France would be under his control, not the communists. With this declaration, he secured his political dominance, quelling fears of a leftist uprising and positioning himself as the man who would guide France through its post-war reconstruction. While Paris celebrated, the situation in Germany was bleak. Choltitz, who had spared the City of Light, faced immediate consequences for his decision. Back in Germany, Nazi authorities convened a hasty court-martial, trying Choltitz in absentia for treason. However, thanks to some powerful allies within the military hierarchy, the trial was delayed long enough for the war to end before a verdict could be reached. Diverting Allied forces to liberate Paris had unintended and far-reaching consequences. The campaign to free the city drained critical fuel supplies and resources, stalling the Allies' advance toward Germany. As a result, the Allied forces were unable to breach the German border before winter set in. This delay gave the Wehrmacht time to regroup and fortify their defences along the Siegfried Line. The cold, brutal winter of 1944 to 1945 caused the front to stagnate, and the war dragged on with a renewed ferocity. Hitler seized the opportunity to launch a counter-offensive, mobilising over 600,000 troops for the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes. The Allies were caught off guard, suffering heavy losses in the dense forests of Hürtgen and enduring a devastating defeat at Arnhem, where British forces were crushed in Operation Market Garden. After Paris was taken by the Americans and the French resistance in August 1944, the city saw a wave of reprisals, particularly against women who had collaborated with the German occupiers. These women, known as les tendus, the shorn, were often publicly humiliated in the streets, their heads shaved as a symbol of their betrayal. Many had relationships with German soldiers, while others worked for the Germans in administrative roles. Public sentiment against collaborators was intense, and these women were paraded through the streets, often subjected to verbal abuse and physical violence. While the majority faced public humiliation rather than imprisonment or death, some were also beaten or killed by local mobs. This act of collective shaming became one of the most visible and immediate consequences of the liberation, as Parisians sought to take back control of their city and cleanse it of the stain of collaboration. The liberation of Paris itself was not as bloody as other battles of World War II, but it did involve significant casualties. During the battle, approximately 1,000 members of the French resistance and around 3,200 German soldiers were killed. The Americans also sustained casualties during the fighting, though their numbers were considerably lower, as the German forces in Paris, led by General Dietrich von Choltitz, eventually chose to surrender rather than destroy the city, as stated earlier. In the days following the liberation, there were further purges, including the execution of collaborators and German soldiers, but the larger toll of deaths came from the battle itself, leaving behind a Paris that, though physically intact, was deeply scarred by the harsh retribution that followed. And with that, we wrap up today's video. I'm incredibly grateful to have you here until the end. Your support truly means the world to me. A huge shout out to my amazing patrons. If you'd like to support the channel or get access to some exclusive content, the links to my Patreon and Instagram are down below. I hope you learned something new, and as always, I'll see you in the next adventure. Take care and goodbye for now.